And welcome back to the Hot Lap, where we are going to be discussing Andretti Motorsport, that 11th elusive F1 team that is currently so controversial coming out of the Qatar Grand Prix. And there's been quite a few really interesting articles on this Andretti team. You know, Corinne Chandlock's written one, which we'll get into, and so is Motorsport Magazine on their website, which I'd like to get into. But who is Andretti Motorsport? Well, have I got some stats for you? Here it is. It's currently an IndyCar team. They're not just an IndyCar team, but this is what they're best known for. And they've won 4 championships. They've started 349 races, 66 wins, 218 podiums, 44 poles, and 55 fastest laps. So I think you can agree with me, in IndyCar at least, Andretti Motorsport definitely know what they are doing. But let's get into that Corinne Chandlock article. And he's basically explaining the entry bid for Andretti F1, and it really explains it, I think, quite well, and some of the issues. And as we know, Mohammed Ben Salem, the FIA president, is very keen for this Andretti Motorsport to happen. So the article starts by saying this big talking point coming in Qatar, and I think out of Qatar as well, was whether F1 would let Andretti Formula Racing, in partnership with Cadillac, join the grid in the near future. And as we know, the FIA confirmed ahead of the race weekend that they'd been successful. They'd greenlight this, what is quite a difficult FIA process to get through. He said this, of course, has got fans very excited, but he thinks it's important to try and put a bit more meat on the bone. As always in F1, he says, nothing is ever simple. And as Murray Walker always said, if is F1 spelled backwards. So any new team that wants to compete in F1, they've got to go through a few tests, so to speak, let's say. Tests. There's kind of like three phases that Corinne Chandlock says. So in phase 1, this is where the FIA invites new teams to express an interest in entering the championship. And on this occasion, there are 4 teams that did so. So phase 2, these 4 teams, in this case, were assessed on their sporting and technical ability and the ability of the team to raise and maintain sufficient funding to allow participation in the championship at a competitive level and the team's experience and human resources. So understandably, no one wants a Formula 1 team that is simply going to sit at the back of the grid and just make up the numbers. And Formula 1 did something like that in 1997 when they added the 107% qualifying rule, where if you weren't within 107% of pole, because at the time it was a 1-hour session, you potentially were not going to be in the race, unless I think in the practice you'd done like a representative lap time that showed you probably would have been. And as was the case with Ricardo Rosset in the Tyrrell in 98, he didn't qualify much. And one of the drivers, I'm not too sure who it was. I'd probably have to Google it, but it was in the Super Aguri teams. One of the slightly less talented drivers in Formula 1 at least, but I'm sure they were good elsewhere, didn't qualify as well under that 107% rule. There were potentially others, but there we go. Because sometimes, as I mentioned, you'd have like a big team not qualify or not do a lap, but they did a lap in practice that would have been, was in 107%. I digress. So the selection criteria also included sustainability management in line with the FIA's ambition of this net zero goal. So Andretti were the only one of these 4 teams to progress through phase 2. So it was showing, these were 4 serious bids. It wasn't just, someone filling out an application form saying, please, can I enter F1? So phase 3, yes, enter phase 3. So it's very clear that any new team, it must secure a commercial agreement with Formula 1 management, who are basically known as Liberty Media by a lot of people. In the past, some teams have raced without a commercial agreement in place, but from 2022, this all changed, and it's clear now without this commercial agreement, you cannot enter the championship. And this is where all this controversy is coming from Andretti F1. And it's not Michael Andretti. I think it's not the Andretti team that are creating the controversy. They want to enter Formula 1. It's the other 10 teams, potentially, that are causing this controversy. But what is the FIA's position on this 11th team? So the FIA's president, Ben Sullum, he's been very vocal about wanting to see Andretti on the essentially on the grid. His belief is that the FIA is the landlord of the F1 World Championships and that Liberty Media management are merely the leaseholders. Therefore, in Ben's mind, the FIA should have ultimate control over all who participate. Now, technically, the teams pay fees to the FIA to get an entrance licence, and that's from the national arm of the governing body to compete. However, Liberty Media, otherwise known as FOM, Formula One Management, they are clear that they cannot be forced by the FIA into signing this commercial agreement with Andretti. And this is where, Karun Chandler nicely put, this is where the political tug of war is brewing. So, what is the position of the existing 10 teams in Formula One? So FOM's opposition aligns with the majority of the 10 teams, being against Andretti joining the championship, as they believe it will hurt them financially. Now, there are 3 general brackets under which the teams seem to be unhappy with the potential Andretti entry. We've got the valuation of the teams. Let me just show you let me just quickly transition to the article here. We've got the valuation of the teams, the dilution of their income from FOM, battling another team for the sponsorship pool coming into F1. Now, in general, they all seem to be singing from this same hymn sheet by publicly saying that any new team should only be allowed if they add value to the championship, and this is something between FOM and Andretti to work out privately. The likes of Toto Wolff and Lawrence Stroll have taken a clear public stance against the Andretti project, but without going too heavily on the details. I mean, a lot of fans, I think like myself, would love an 11th F1 team. We haven't had more than that. I think we had, in 2010, we had the new teams enter as well. So I think we had up to 24 cars, didn't we? I think, or maybe even more. But, surely it's good to have more competition. So Karun goes on to say that the outlier has been the eloquent James Vowles from Williams, who seems to be the only team boss this weekend to take this bold step of upsetting the fans by sticking his head above the parapet and outlining in more detail exactly why he and his ultimate owners at Dorilton Capital, sorry, I'm going to get that wrong, Dorilton Capital, aren't in support of the Andretti grid. He raised a fair point, saying that while the top 3 teams are now profitable, there are still several others, Williams included, who are losing money and relying on owners essentially. On the owners to fill up that pot. Now, Mercedes, for example, they published their financials showing a profit of over 100 million in 2022. Now, 19% of that was their applied science division. So, Karun says he does have some sympathy for James, as Williams are in a unique position in a sense that they don't represent a consumer brand that can justify any losses, like marketing, for example, Red Bull and AlphaTauri and Haas automations for their current F1 team. But, I mean, even Red Bull Christian Horner says that 11th team on the grid is more of an issue for the FIA than him, but he did say that General Motors coming into F1 would be massively positive. I digress. So this has historically been the case, including BAR and Honda and Mercedes, where, as we know, James spent the last 2 decades, and the owners were all losing money to justify it as a marketing expenditure that they could afford it. The idea being win on Sunday, sell on Monday. So the teams have all been talking about this impact of an extra team that will have an effect on their franchise values. Now, technically, there's no such thing as a franchise system. Unlike some sporting leagues, the teams are entrants, as we've said before, of this FIA World Championship. Karun goes on to say that this valuation game is a tricky point to quantify because this Concord agreement is the commercial agreement between the FOM, basically Liberty Media, and teams. And interestingly, and here is potentially the kicker for the current 10 teams, it provides the existence of 12 teams. Now, the counter argument being made against the teams is that in terms of valuation, the existing teams should be valued as one of 12, not one of 10. So Andretti entering the championship is, from Andretti's point of view, kind of irrelevant, I'd imagine. But what's the financial argument being made? So the point around, once again, this pot, there's this cake, which we'll get into. The exact details of this pot being spread, as per the Concord Agreement, is kind of confidential, but it's rumoured that it's 1.4 billion. So of this, we believe that 400 million is paid as bonuses to teams who have won the Constructors' Championship, with the remaining 1 billion divided up in a sliding scale amongst the 10 teams. So as you may know, the winning constructor would probably get the most money, correct? And it's believed they're going to receive about 14%, and the team finishing 10th would receive about 6% of this massive pay pot. And it seems like the Concord Agreement allows for an adjustment of this sliding scale from 8th to 12th place. Should there be more than 10 teams on the grid? So if Andretti does join the grid, there's no doubt that this will affect the teams. And this 1 billion, it's essentially cutting a cake. Instead of cutting a cake into 10, you're cutting it into 11 pieces, dividing it 11 ways, therefore leaving some teams poorer. And he says on average by about 5 million a year, maybe based on that sliding scale. So to offset this, though, the Concord Agreement, there's this figure of 200 million, and that's set as an anti-dilution fee to compensate the existing teams. A bit of simple maths will let you know that they will be compensated for 4 years, these teams, and that's something that the Andretti Cadillac team may have to pay the teams as kind of like an extra entry fee, let's say, to say, sorry about that, your cake is being split, here's 200 million. Now, there is also some rumours, it's not in the article, that could be increased quite a lot more, maybe even by double or more, which sounds ridiculous. But Karun says now whether this number can be increased and by how much remains to be seen. He says you can look at this situation in reverse and say the existing teams have effectively been taking in some extra income and above the Concord Agreement, and what the Concord Agreement was designed to do, as the pie is only being sliced into 10 and not 12. From Andretti's perspective, this is the narrative they want people to consider. So, on the point of battling for the sponsorship, there's no doubt that this is going to negatively affect Formula One. And as we know, we've got football in America, you've got baseball, you've got football in America, you've got football around the world. Two different sports. Soccer, us fellow Americans we call it football. But there's no doubt that there's all these sports vying for sponsorship, essentially, and that's going to negatively affect it. One extra F1 team means there is one team that want all these sponsors. So, but what is the case for this Andretti entry? Well, Karun says his personal view is he would like to see Andretti on the grid. I think every Formula One fan pretty much does. But he says from a neutral sporting perspective, I believe, he says, that having 2 extra cars on the grid is good for the sport, good for the show, and good for young drivers. And he uses the example of Oscar Piastri had to spend a year on the bench. And this guy was a really talented driver. Not only that, he was the reigning Formula 2 champion. And there weren't enough seats. If you remember, Esteban Ocon had to spend a year on the side because there weren't enough places. Felipe Drugovich also. And now, another example, how good is he? Liam Lawson. But he's going to potentially, if Perez stays at Red Bull, nothing changes, he's going to spend 2024 on the side. So he says there are plenty of the people in the paddock who are very quick to discredit the Andretti operation. He mentions that all weekend in Qatar, people were saying things like it's not a real GM deal. They're going to badge someone else's engine. That means, for example, they'll take a Mercedes engine and stick the GM Cadillac badge on. Or they're going to be utterly rubbish. They have no idea how hard F1 is compared to what they've been doing, or even which of the current Netflix generation of fans even know the Andretti name. Oh, not very nice comments, are they? And Karun says maybe these points are true, maybe Andretti will fail, but he's basically saying he'd much rather have them. And he's saying it seems like a risk worth taking for me. He cites the fact, imagine if Steve Jobs didn't decide to take the risk of ditching buttons on the iPhone, or Elon Musk didn't push forward with Tesla. So, in conclusion, he kind of gives an example, and I thought it's quite an interesting one. 2 examples, in fact. He says sometimes the great team leaders need to think of the greater good. And he cites the fact that in 1960, Colin Chapman, who worked with Ford and Cosworth to create the legendary DFV engine, initially had exclusive rights to this engine. Now, Walter Hayes from Ford and Chapman recognised that the sport on the whole would suffer quite badly if the Lotus DFV cars dominated everything, and this really good engine they had it's going to make it absolutely boring. But they all suggested it should be made to other, available to other teams after a season, for example, and it was. Potentially, you could make an argument it saved the sport at the time because it made it more competitive and other teams had a competitive engine. Now, in a similar vein, McLaren waived their rights to exclusively use Mercedes engine. And this allowed a certain 2009 team by the name of Braun GP, who just bought Honda, I think for £1, to receive their engine supply that ended up carrying a certain Jenson Button to that World Championship. And this was because McLaren realised it was for the greater good of the sport not to lose another team from the Formula One grid. And that team then became Mercedes. Mercedes, of course, bought Braun at the end of that season and bought out their part ownership of McLaren. So almost by doing that, did McLaren sign their own, decade of decadence death knell? I don't know. But moving on. So I think, and I completely agree with Karoon, that I think it's going to be a positive. I think it may bring more eyes on Formula One as well with the Cadillac name in there. I mean, you can make an argument that for teams like Haas that would want maybe more American sponsorship, it could hurt. Formula One is in a much better place than it was, and surely it's a good thing. But there we go. But they did mention, who is this Michael Andretti guy? Well, here we go. There he is. Michael Andretti, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. So, who is Michael Andretti? Well, he was born on the 5th of October 1962, and not anymore, but he is a former racing driver. Now, statistically, this is what I thought was quite interesting. He's one of the most successful drivers in the history of American open wheel racing. He won the 1991 kart championship, which was kind of like IndyCar at the time. As IndyCar split into two divisions, and kart initially was the more successful of the two, but we'll get into that another day. But essentially, he won the 1991 IndyCar championship, let's say, and he amassed 42 victories, and that's the most in the kart era and fourth most of all time. Now, he retired and he owns Andretti Autosport. But there we go. But that's not just everything. He was born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and if you didn't know, I'm sure you did, his dad is Mario Andretti, the 1978 Formula One championship. I think he won what, 12 victories potentially. I think he won 12 victories. There he is with his father. Oh, Mario. I mean, that guy's a legend as well. So absolutely fantastic. Now, not only was he really, really successful in IndyCar, he also did, in 1991, he raced the 24 Hours of Daytona. And he was, it was dad and son. And they're also joined by Mario's other younger son, Jeff Andretti. And as I mentioned, he'd won the 1991 IndyCar championship. So, he also made it to Formula One, and that was 1993. He raced for McLaren Honda, partnered by Ayrton Senna. And, well, how did he do? He ended up getting sacked, unfortunately. There he is in the Newman Haas after when he came back to car. But poor old Michael ended up getting sacked by McLaren in Italy. And then in Portugal, we had Mika Hakkinen, who was the McLaren reserve driver, turn up. But was it a tiny bit unfair? Well, I mean, let's look at his F1 stats. Yeah, he had 13 starts. Okay, 0 wins. He got 1 podium, no fastest laps. The McLaren wasn't that good at the time, and his teammate was Ayrton Senna. 7 points, 3 points finishes. Best start being 5th, best finish being 3rd in what was not the best car. You could make an argument he's done better than Sergio Perez, given the fact that car potentially could have been like the 3rd best car maybe, and not the best car. And in hindsight, I mean, I know, the IndyCar champion, everyone kind of laughed, and the Americans can't make it in Formula One, which was really cruel because there have been American F1 champions. And look at obviously Michael Andretti's dad. But there we go. So I think that's in hindsight, looking back, I think that's fairly respectable given the chances they gave. But it was Mika Hakkinen who ended up replacing him. He then returned. He then returned to kart and didn't do too bad with Newman. With Newman Haas. So that's essentially who Michael Andretti is. I mean, there he is in the McLaren. I don't know if that's Donington, but I'm not sure. I know it wasn't a good race. But there's him in one of the ovals, and that's him in the McLaren again. That's kind of what he looks like now. If you weren't too sure. So we've got Motorsport magazine though have got quite an interesting article about it, about the hypocrisy over Andretti F1, the teams waging war on the 11th team, which I do kind of want to share with you. So bear with me. I'm just going to set it up. I'm just hopefully going to... There we go. Oh, what a smooth transition. So this article, written yesterday at the time of writing, says basically Andretti's bid to set up a new F1 team. It's been approved by the FIA, but now faces a much tougher task. So this is by Chris Medlin, and he said there was fairly a dull moment over the Qatar Grand Prix weekend. The range of storylines, Max Verstappen won the title, we all know that. And he said about the approval, it looked to be on its way for a number of months, and all that it's have to do is officially move the process onto negotiations with FOM, Liberty Media. Opposition for FOM was also not unexpected, he says, given the comments made by teams and Stefano Domenicali ever since Andretti publicly announced its plans to set up this new team. But as you might have picked up from the post-race diary, that's what the Motorsport kind of like features, he said what really stood out to me was the hypocrisy of other teams. He said heightening the sense that they were clutching at straws was that they were each making different points that failed to back up their arguments. He said, now I get it. If you're in charge of a team, you're hardly going to turn around and say, sure, I'd love to split the prize money 11 ways rather than 10 and give away a few £1 million to another team that is only trying to enter. Now F1 is booming. He says not only is it booming in terms of interest, but the cost cap ensures teams have a very good chance of being profitable, with Red Bull team principal Christian Horner admitting last year that the prize money received by the top teams exceeds the cost cap amount, and those at the back of the grid have a 70 to 80% of their costs covered by the prize fund. Let's be honest, that's a fairly significant stat, isn't it? He went on to say that the Williams team principal tried to explain that the constructor is financially unstable, as if Formula One is not in a position to definitely sustain the existing 10 teams. And he then completely undermined that by revealing the instability comes from the fact that he has convinced owners Dalton Capital to invest hundreds of millions into trying to make Williams more competitive. It becomes very clear why they're very careful about diluting what we've already got, because he says it's just more losses on the table, he said. Now, we've been clear from the beginning, more than happy bringing in new entities, but the pie has to grow as a result of it, not shrink, and so far it's just shrinking. The article says those comments sidestep the fact that the pie has already grown significantly. The teams are now sharing around $950 million in revenues between them in 22, or comfortably over $1 billion based on Liberty Media's reporting. And significantly, he says that's a 27% increase in 4 years. Now, Ferrari's Fred Vassar questioned what Andretti would bring to the sport, and it says perhaps he missed what Vowles had just said in the very same press conference when the Williams boss spoke of a desire to work with General Motors, which is planning to enter F1 in partnership with Andretti. Others struggled to have a convincing case for this instability that Vowles had raised. He said, I think, what is stability, said Haas. Haas is Gunther Steiner. In F1, he says, you always need to invest. You cannot say we don't need to invest anymore. Some teams make profit now, but the profit is not hundreds of millions. The big teams, some of them make profit, but everyone is still working hard to put as much investment as possible. Now, he says, wherever the money comes from, if it's the shareholders, if it's the sponsors, but for sure, a big part of it is from this FOM income. And all of a sudden, if you lose that 10%, you've then got to find it. Is it an investor? Is it a sponsor? But it's still work we have to do. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to do it. So, a Motorsport magazine says Steiner isn't wrong about Haas being hundreds of millions in profit, but some teams certainly are managing to benefit from the situation, with Mercedes reporting pre-tax profits of $41 million in 2022. And he says fans don't support a sports team based on its ability to make money. I feel pretty safe in saying no Mercedes fan is wildly celebrating that profit figure of $75 million of dividends going to Mercedes-Benz Toto Wolff in Ineos. Instead, he says, they are concerned with when Lewis Hamilton and George Russell might have a car and lets them challenge Max Verstappen for race wins and championships. Amen, I say. So he goes on to say, but let's do the simple maths on the starting front. Teams receive prize money on a sliding scale, but rudimentary equalising it out equates to 95 million per team with 10 constructors. If Andretti had been on the grid getting the same share, then that drops to just over 86 million per team, a loss of 8.6 million per team. At that rate, Andretti's anti-dilution team payment, and we kind of mentioned this, of $200 million, that's £163 million, would cover such a loss for each team for 2 years, he says. But by having that 16.3 million in the bank ahead of time, it could extend a little further, and that's without calculating the impact that Andretti's arrival would have on boosting F1's revenue. So he says, try and make the anti-dilution payment of 600 million, which has been rumoured. That's 489 million pounds, $600 million, as has been suggested, and teams would have been compensated on the current terms for 6 years. He says the latter figure tallies more with Steiner's view that he wants not a massive dilution fee, an appropriate dilution fee based on the value of a team now. And he says that value has skyrocketed. Earlier, Alpine sold a stake in its team, which was valued at 700 million. The front runners, he suggested, are likely to be worth $1 billion. Now, what teams are trying to protect is their franchise value. Now, this is despite F1 not being a franchise model. It's a sport where the FIA can approve entrants, and the rules, as we say, allow up to 12 teams. So, I mean, the article goes on, and he says multiple polls have found that 80 to 90% of fans want this 11th team. So who will be listened to? The teams sitting on their bulging valuations, or the spectators who actually provide that value? And that's interesting. It's F1, any sport would be nowhere without the fans. So, I mean, what more can you say? He said there's an old adage of making hay while the sun shines. F1's boom is an opportunity to strengthen the field even further. The good times may not last forever, and if one or more teams were in financial difficulty in the future, then what? If not, given that previously interested parties would want to come back to a less lucrative series, especially if they've been shunned before, and F1 could find itself and that all-important pie shrinking. He says it's obvious that it's about making as much money as possible in the short term and not wanting anyone else to benefit, even if they all do. Liberty Media's mantra, often repeated by former commercial director Sean Bratches, was all boats are lifted on a rising tide, and that the fans are central to what they do. And that's because fans watching lead to big broadcast deals that go into F1's revenues, that also feed the desire for more places to host races because of the viewership they reach. Then that leads to sponsors increasing their spend because they want to hit markers, and everyone's happy. I mean, there we go. He says you get the point. So I think Andretti in F1 is a good thing. What do you guys think? Let us know. Comment below. If you've been here a while, like, subscribe. I know I'm so sorry this has been like a really wordy episode, but I was quite passionate to get into it, and I thought these 2 articles were really, really good. So I'm so sorry I've been talking at you with a slideshow of like just a few pictures. But if you made it to the end, you are an F1 world champion. Thank you very much. Thank you for anyone that likes, subscribes. We've got a few more subscribers. Fantastic. It just gave me a massive smile. It makes this worth doing. Thank you very much. Speak to you soon.